button. Okay, so welcome to the episode 16 of the Real Fake Swords and Fake Real Swords podcast. Our honored guest today is Mr. Jonathan Bluestein, all the way in Israel. And he's been a researcher, especially I got to know him on social media. He had a book published. What's that called?
Research of Martial Arts.
Research in Martial Arts. And so Mr. Bluestein, please tell us about yourself.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
No problem.
I am Israeli, Jewish, born and raised. Got into the martial arts about 16 years of age. Was interested in martial arts since I was a little boy, but only got into them as a teen. I started out with Western boxing, which is a great place to start if you're looking for realism and you want to know what martial arts are really about. Because boxing delivers simplified yet a highly coherent package in terms of fighting. Gives you just a few moves to work with, and then you hone and perfect them, and you get to work with them in a rather realistic setting early on. Realistic does not mean it's like maybe strict realistic. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Depends on who your coach is, what you're doing. But in terms of you get into the ring with somebody, or you just do drills with somebody, and you know if you're not going to be focused, if you're not going to be into it in the moment, there cannot be any gaps of concentration or consciousness. If you're not going to be there, you're going to get smacked, and you're going to get smacked hard. And you learn this early on, so you learn two things. One is the reality of fighting, and two, you learn to get hit, which is also very important. A lot of people, you see their martial performance being hindered in actual application just because they're not used to getting hit.
Right. Once, the other guys, the air doesn't hit back. You know what I'm saying?
It's funny. I just saw a meme with Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee famously said, boards don't hit back. And then there are two pictures of him practicing iron palm. And breaking stones and bricks. It's ironic. But there was, the Bruce Lee in the media, in the movies, and the TV series. And then there was real-life Bruce Lee, who's way more of a traditionalist than he's given credit for.
Yeah, how so? I mean, have you studied about him and talk about him for what you find?
I'm by no means an expert, and I'm not a fan either. Actually, I respect the man. I was a good martial artist, a great athlete, much better athlete than a martial artist. I don't like his acting, but he did have quite a lot of serious traditional training. Now, he had a very different outlook to many other people because the way he went about training, he never, I think, in any style ever got more than maybe 2.5, 3 years of formal training. He got most of his formal training from, of course, Ip Man, and then many people say that even under Ip Man, he studied mostly under William Chong or some other guy, one of the senior students. There were many senior students at the time. And then later on, what he did was he went through from one teacher to another, one master to another, and studied a little bit here and there, got their methods, what he liked, he put in his own practice, sometimes into his own so-called system, which is like more of a concept of training, of course, Jeet Kune Do. And he did a lot of things that people don't talk about. People are familiar with, his nunchaku, which he got either from Fumio Demura Sensei or Dan Santo, or both of them. And he did anything and everything under the sun. He went and he did fencing and Western boxing and kickboxing, a lot of thanks to those stuff with Chuck Norris. He did a lot of traditional Chinese martial arts training, also with Southern Mantis, for instance.
I didn't know that.
Mantis. Yeah, a little bit, just a very short period of training under a famous Grandmaster Lam San. I think he paid for few private classes, and arguably, I don't want to claim anything because I've heard different types of eyewitness testimonies to it, but probably studied with just a little bit here and there from other disciples of late Grandmaster Lamsang, and then many traditionalist teachers, and also, like I said, he did some iron palm. Apparently, there are pictures proving it. And he took all of this and he combined it into his own understanding. Like I said, some things he did practice, but he did not teach. For instance, in Juklum Safran Mantis, which is actually a system I study and I'm affiliated with, there is a hard Qigong set, which is somewhat equivalent, similar to Sanchin Kata in traditional Okinawan karate, but still quite different. And then Bruce Lee had apparently studied just a few moves and how to work on the tendons and the hard Qigong through these moves. Not the complete set, just a little bit. And then in one of his movies, there's actually one posture, and there is a famous poster showcasing that posture by him, where he sucks in the belly and leans forward and presses the palm very, very strongly towards the camera. It's actually a very specific and unique posture taken from that hard Qigong of Juklum Safran Mantis. You could really see he walked it, and it's from the form. So he was taught a simplified version of it, and which still can yield much benefit for certain purposes. And that's something he learned. I actually, once I put on Facebook a picture I found of him in the middle of demonstrating Sambojin, which is most fundamental form in all of Safran Mantis, Choga lineage as well. And he actually studied some version of Sambojin as well. So he did study it, but he did not teach it, because what he taught was the condensed version and the principles which he thought were worth teaching to his own students at the time, various times. So in any case, back to my personal history, right?
Right. It seems that you and Bruce Lee actually have somewhat in common in that both of you studied multiple styles, and both of you have a very scholarly approach to the martial arts.
Well, possibly. Maybe if I had met the guy, and he would have definitely been a most interesting person to meet and talk to and train with, and maybe we would have found more commonalities than differences. Who knows?
Yeah. So now, go ahead. You saying that you were into Okinawan karate after the boxing, correct?
Yeah. We talked about this earlier before the recording. So I looked at boxing. It was something I loved. I still like boxing, though in modern times, I mean, I wouldn't. Never mind. You know what I'm talking about. If you follow boxing, you know that the 80s and the 90s are not what we got nowadays with most people. In any case, I was looked at boxing and saw that in my gym, as in most boxing gyms, you don't see a lot of people over 35, over 40 years old, because it's strenuous, it's difficult, and it's a sport, on top of it being a martial art. And people get a lot of injuries. It's just the nature of it. And I want to do something that I can keep doing for a lifetime.
Right.
Also, something which was more systematic. I found myself in Shido-ryu karate, which I studied under Itzy Cohen Sensei. He just came out with a book, Karate Uchinadi. Sorry, not Karate Uchinadi. Oh my God, I'll have to look. Karate Uchinadi. I'm terribly sorry. That's the name of the system by Hanshi Patrick McCarthy Sensei. Let's see right here. Just looking at it on the app. Actually, no. I'm confusing it. It's the name of the book, Karate Uchinadi. And that's a book about the history, mostly of actually Okinawa, and then the relationship between the history of Okinawa to traditional karate training. So if you're highly interested in that, especially the historical aspect of that, check out that book. So I studied with Itzy Cohen Sensei for a while. Wonderful human being, and he was determined to deliver very traditionalist Okinawan teaching at his dojo in Israel. At the time, he had a very Okinawan-looking dojo with a lot of wood, with the kamidana, that small temple that you got in the front of the dojo that you bowed in the beginning of class, and overall very traditional Okinawan etiquette, which at times is similar to what you see in China, but also bears the influences of modern Japanese karate, which is more orderly and martial-like, and I'm saying martial-like in the military context. People in rows and counting numbers as you execute the movements and that sort of thing. Like sometimes a little bit like boot camp. I know I went through infantry boot camp, but still more Okinawan at heart, which is maybe more community-oriented and community-derived. The Okinawans, they are, ethnically, you can say they're Japanese, but they're still, it's like the difference between maybe people who descended from the Beijing and Tianjin area in northern China and the folks you see in Hong Kong and Guangdong. So, they're part of the same nation. And nowadays, most of them also can speak the same language, which is Mandarin Chinese. But originally, they had different dialects. They had subtly different cultures, and they're like different tribes of the same extended family. Would that be a good way to put it?
Right.
Yeah, so the Okinawans are the same. It's like difference between Northern Chinese historically and Southern Chinese. They kind of had their own thing going for them. And also, whilst the Japanese were for centuries and still sometimes hostile towards the Chinese and vice versa, the Okinawans traded a lot with China, and that's how Okinawan martial arts were formed mostly. They had their own thing going on where they created their native forms of self-defense, which is reminiscent to how the Israelis created Krav Maga. But then most of the influence came from China, and a lot of Chinese etiquette and Confucianism going on in traditional Okinawan karate, and that was a wonderful experience studying at the dojo, which is still running, by the way. Ichiko Sensei still has his dojo, wonderful dojo. And for that, I was looking for, I don't know, I had a calling. I felt something inside of me having more appeal for Chinese things in general, and rather not so much Japanese and Okinawan. There's certain things in Okinawan karate which I was a little bit perplexed about, things like power generation, how you generate what I term nowadays fajin. A lot of good teachers of traditional Okinawan karate, they have some form of fajin, but it's not something that they can often really explain, or they explain it in terms that maybe I couldn't understand that well, or things pertaining to structure. How do you work with an opponent and being able to relax your structure and be at ease and not stiffen up and panic even under pressure? And that's something with Okinawan karate, maybe you get that more through experience, but in the Chinese arts you have very specialized methods to get it. And in any case, just I drifted more towards the Chinese, so I bid farewell in a very respectful and thankful manner to my teacher Ichiko Sensei. We're still good friends to this day. And I went on with my journey, and eventually after visiting many schools, I got to my Shifu. His name is Nitzan Owen, very Israeli name. Means pine sprout in Hebrew. And Shifu Nitzan had spent many years studying the martial arts. I think he'd been practicing martial arts over 20 years when I met him, and about 10 years doing Xingyi Chuan and other traditional Chinese martial arts.
Like Dai style Xingyi? Dai Xingyi?
No, not Dai style Xingyi. No. A traditional Hebei style Xingyi Chuan.
Okay.
And also some Shanxi Xingyi Chuan from the Song family.
Okay,
so he studied for 7 years straight in Tianjin, China, and that was after he had already possessed like maybe 8 or 9 years doing Goju-ryu karate and some Chinese arts with teachers here in Israel. And then he studied primarily with Master Zhou Jingxuan. Zhou Jingxuan who sadly passed away. He was my shigong under Shifu Bluestein, and he passed away sadly in 2016. I think roughly 2 years ago. A great man, and a very talented man. Master Joe had studied the martial arts since age 9. He had, I think, it depends on how you count, but he had roughly 13 teachers and was a disciple of about 6 of them. And that's very unusual in China because oftentimes if you're someone's disciple, then other people wouldn't be so inclined to take you in. But he had very different circumstances because he lived in Tianjin all his life. And in Tianjin, there are many, many, many martial artists and teachers and traditions. And unlike in some other places, they often cooperate. Of course, they have their politics and their wars and everything like in any other place. But there is more cooperation, at least that I have seen, and at least in his time. And he would train at the parks, and these teachers, they all knew each other, so he was training the park since age 9. And when he got better, his teacher just, I think his first teacher taught him Chodiao Fanzitrin. So it's a very common Shaolin-derived system. With a lot of kicking. It's not that common in the West, but it's very common in northern China. And once he got good, his teacher just passed him along, and the other teachers passed him along between their friends, and they say like, "Oh, this student is really good. He picks things up really quickly. Maybe you take him in. Maybe you teach him something." And then he found himself, every 5-6 years or so, he got to study with 2 or 3 other teachers, and he could absorb things like a sponge. It was incredible. When I met him, he was in his 40s. He passed away at age 50. He had complications of stroke, and he got bad treatment at the hospital. And fortunately, they accidentally turned him into a vegetable. And from there, they just, they let the family just let him pass peacefully rather than remain in that state for the rest of his life. But when he was alive, he had such fierceness and such energy and such talent. He would just absorb. And when I knew him in his 40s, he just knew hundreds of forms. And and of course, one cannot practice hundreds of forms. But the guy, he would recall a form he studied when he was 15, and he hadn't practiced it for, 20 years. And he could just do it magnificently. He had just this incredible muscle memory, very unusual. And it doesn't make sense. Like I said, he had 13 teachers. He studied at least 13 different martial arts, and he taught 6. Now, you cannot possibly practice 13 or even 6 styles at the same time. Doesn't make sense. And he did. What he did was he would practice one art for anywhere between 5 and 10 years, or sometimes a little less if he didn't intend to teach it. And then he would move on to practice something else. And usually he would practice 2 martial arts at a time, which is manageable. For instance, my arts are Xingyichuan, Piguajang, and Juklum Sovereign Mantis. Now, when I began Juklum Sovereign Mantis, I had to gradually let my Piguajang go. Because you just cannot, unless you're training 6 hours a day or more every day, you really cannot manage 3 different martial arts at a time. And even if one was training 6 hours or more a day, then still, to be able to grasp so much and manifest so much in your body, you have to be an exceptional talent. I know such a person who's still alive. For instance, my friend Shifu Bluestein from Canada. He is exceptional like that. You got to talk to this man sometime. And he knows a lot about traditional Chinese martial arts and weaponry as well. He's a great guy. So he's doing entire system of drunken fist from northern China, which is exceedingly rare, which was passed on within certain Ma family. And in that drunken fist system alone, they got like a few martial arts. And then he's also doing Xini Liu Hechun and Baguajang. And he keeps doing it all at the same time, and that's quite a lot. But he's very dedicated and trains many hours a day. And he has some sponge-like talent, which I do not possess. I cannot go to that capacity, maybe in 10-20 years. But right now, not possible. So in any case, as for back to Zhou Shifu in China, he mostly, when I met him, he mostly taught Baji Chuan and Jinggang Basher. Baji Chuan is very well-known martial art from northern China. Shaolin Jinggang Basher is an obscure, possibly extinct style now from the old Shaolin Temple. Now, when the Chinese government rebuilt the Shaolin Temple in the 80s, it was just they destroyed it prior, and there are like maybe 5 monks living there, according to eyewitness testimony. But before it was destroyed that last time, it was still active, and there are various martial arts being taught there. Shaolin Jinggang Baoshi was one of them. It's a very typical Shaolin art. I wrote an article about this martial art. It's called The Lost Art of Buddha's Guardian. I think if you Google I'll see if you can find it on Google. Lost Art of Guardian. Let's see if it's you can find it like that. No, it finds some different Buddhist stuff. Let's see.
Let's move on. We're running on the record, so let's continue.
Okay, so basically, if you just write like on Google Jonathan Bluestein, Jinggang Basher, you'd find this. Jinggang Basher is spelled JINGANGBASHI. So on top of these two martial arts, he taught some Chojiao Fanzi Chuan for whoever was interested, and Xingyi Chuan. And I studied most of my Xingyi Chuan from Shifu Bluestein, from my primary teacher, and my Piguajang from Shifu Bluestein, and my Shigong Master Zhou. Then myself from Mantis, I studied with Sifu Sapir Tal here in Israel, who's a disciple of Master Henry Puyi, recently deceased. May his soul be blessed. A great man, a very respectable member of Chinese martial arts community in the United States. Have you ever heard his name?
I mean, I've seen like social media posts about his passing, but I'm not too well versed in the Southern Mantis community.
Yeah, sure. So his lineage is carried on. He has a number of dedicated disciples. My teacher among them, with the three head disciples being Tommy Kwan, Abraham Chu, and Paul Dermody. I think all three of them live in Texas. So that's my background, and with my martial arts come weapons, of course, and I've studied various types of weaponry. With Xingyi Chuan, the only weapon I studied is the spear, which I practiced with both medium and long spears. With Piguajang, I studied the short staff, which is about the length of a screamer stick, the medium staff, which is like chest height staff, also often called shepherd staff, the Timei Gun, which is the eyebrow height staff, and also the Dao and the Miao Dao.
Right, that's like the most popular weapon for Chinese martial arts nowadays. Everybody wants to do the Miao Dao.
It's strange. I do wonder how the Miao Dao had become that popular. I think just the katana had been popular since forever among Japanese and even Chinese and especially American people alike. And I think it's just occurred to some people at some point, there's like a Chinese katana thing. We can do it just the Chinese way, and that's probably why it became so popular.
Okay, now getting to I've been going to tell you. Okay, you know all these masters that know all the forms and such, but in the impression I get right now, what makes me depressed concerning the Chinese martial arts is that you get all these famous masters. They got all the excellent physical conditioning. They know all these fancy forms, but in my own impression is that the karate people, the Okinawans, right? Their stuff, they can actually fight and apply their art, even in a sports situation, you know, and it's very unlikely, for the Chinese arts, to go the sports way unless it's performing. When you look at the Western martial arts, well, again, I repeat myself from previous episodes, you get, the military arts that become competitive sports such as boxing, fencing, wrestling. The Japanese arts, you get kendo, right, judo, and sport karate. But with the exception of shuaijiao in the Chinese arts, everything else goes to performance. I mean, like, what is your take on that? Have you seen? But I'm doubtful now that they can say, oh, they can move these sifus can move so fast. They know all the forms, right? They're very strong, but in a sports situation, a lot of times I think they have never competed with a resisting opponent that is hitting back.
Yeah, sure. I get what you're saying. So,
right.
Few things here. First of all, I did mention that Shifu, for instance, he knew all these many forms, but that's very unusual. It's just a person who collects forms like other people collect stamps. He's just very exceptional like that. For most people, I actually think that the more forms you know, the more difficulty you'd have actually getting something out of your martial arts.
Right.
That's not a good thing. I mean, forms are a wonderful instrument, but you do have to keep yourself in check and realize that by the end of the day, you either limit the amount you learn or you choose to let one or two forms go to let another one or two forms in. Yeah, you get what I'm saying? So for most people, it's a better idea to maintain a certain size of the curriculum they're going through each week or in maybe a 2-week or a month cycle and not do too much, because you do too much, you don't get much at all. And that's one problem. I mean, like you said, a lot of people just know way more than they can actually get into their bodies. The fact that you go through the motions doesn't mean you get it.
Right.
And if you've been to martial arts Disneyland, like I have been, which is the city of Tianjin, where you go to a park and you can, if you would like, you can get 20 forms a day. I mean, it's so easy. There's so many teachers, and many of them are accessible, especially if you have an introduction. And many of them are also very eager to teach because they fear that they're going to lose a lot of what they know, and it's not going to be maintained for future generations. So, and they're eager to teach, you're eager to get it, and you end up just knowing too much. I know one guy, he went to Tianjin to study Xingyi Chuan, and he just told the teacher, oh man, I got like 2.5 months, just teach me everything. I want to learn as much as possible. And you know how often traditional Chinese teachers are. They say you get what you deserve. That's what you want. That's what you get. So he said, okay. He taught him like almost the entire curriculum of his Xingyi Chuan in 2.5 months, and he practiced several hours a day. He was dedicated. Then he came back to Israel. He figured out, well, I actually don't know anything. First off, I can't remember 2/3 of what he taught me. Second, it's all empty movements. I ain't got no gong fu in it, So
right.
And later he went to my Shifu Nitan, and he told him, well, you gotta teach me from the beginning. I'm willing. I'll do the 5 phases, the wuxing. I'll do that for a year if necessary, but I need to get the basics. I got no gong fu. I just got the movements.
Right.
So, okay. So back to the question: why did Chinese martial arts weaponry become more performance-oriented and not sports-oriented?
Or styling in general, right? And I don't think it's next to impossible to to actually find even high-ranking masters nowadays that can actually do any kind of self-defense with their art. They just do form. And
okay. So several very, very important reasons. First, we had the performance component in European martial arts also in the past, but it was lost. But it had been preserved in the Chinese martial arts, and you gotta ask too, like, why did the Chinese preserve the performance aspect and not the sportive aspect. And part of it is that it has an innate cultural value. So when you live in a village, a backwards village, 100, 200, 300 years ago, don't have any TVs, maybe one or two books in the entire village, what forms of entertainment do you have? Well, you sing, you dance, you play instrument, and you do your martial arts. And the forms they have this innate cultural value to everybody. It's the type of activity that unites the people in the village. It's part of their tradition and cultural identity. So part of why the performance aspect had been preserved in China, and for instance, not in the European, not in European countries.
You have theatric swordplay.
But not just in terms of theatrics. Even if it had martial origins, they preserved it because it's part of their cultural identity, and it reflects the philosophy and the mindset of the people. Which, I mean, in Europe, you see it was preserved sometimes. Like in Portugal, they have legitimate stick fighting, and a few other remote regions in various places in Europe, they preserve a little bit of this tradition here, that tradition there. Overall, in Europe, weapons fighting was meant for people to fight on the battlefield. It did not have that innate cultural value. So, for instance, in Great Britain, for some years, I think it was during the 100 Years' War, for a few decades at least, all male Britons knew how to shoot bow and arrow.
Well, I mean, it's like that in the Chinese Confucian culture as well. There's another individual that came into the previous podcast. I mean, archery, is a very important essence of Confucian culture. But if you go to China today and you say you do traditional archery, people will think you're nuts, right? They will ask you. Are you from Mongolia or are you from Tibet? Right? They're not. It's not in the culture anymore.
Yeah, definitely. So, but in Britain, it was just a law. It was decreed by the king that you gotta teach your son archery, and every Sunday you gotta practice archery. So when you or your sons have to go on the battlefield, you're already skilled archers, because it may take you 100 days to teach someone to wield a sword not well, but well enough to kill people on the battlefield. But it takes way longer to train a very good archer.
Right.
So just because of the nature of the skill, and once these wars and laws and decrees ended, people just neglected the archery altogether. In China, it's different. In China, the government and the Communist Party and various entities, they did away with archery. But there, just people just put the bows and arrows aside and forgot about them once gunpowder got into the picture, or they dethroned their king, etc., etc. So another important reason for the performance versus sports thing is that in the Chinese view, the weapons are very important for empty-handed practice. So even when you look at weapons forms, even if we were to suppose that the weapons form, the weapons practitioner has no clue of how to use that weapon in actual combat.
Right, of course.
He just kind of theoretically knows the techniques, but at least the actual practice and movements in the form are technically correct. So it gives him a lot of benefit for his empty-handed practice. Of course, all the more if he knew how to do it more correctly, if he knew what every move was intended for and was capable of using it. But even without this, it's a great form of exercise, and it complements very well the type of practice you do empty-handed, and it gives you a training partner, because there's a weight that you don't get when you're empty-handed, and there is some resistance. And for instance, when you work with a staff, then just the rubbing and grinding of your closed fist against the staff, that yields way more resistance than just the weight of the staff alone, and you can use it to your advantage to make it more like a live opponent at times with various techniques. So it has that value. And in European traditions, I don't know, it's shown in manuals, and it's said that there had been evolved empty-handed martial arts methods, but none that survive directly to this day. You know, they recreated them for manuals and stories and paintings, etc. So we don't really know what it was really like in the medieval times, in Roman times, in Greek times. We can only guess, but it has been lost for a long time. So the weapons practice was no longer relevant to support the empty-handed practice. So that's another reason you see this performance being maintained in China and not in Europe.
Well, I mean, now like you know, the Chinese martial artists couldn't apply any aspect of their art, with the exception of the throwing, the Shuai because Shuai has been it's the only martial art, military art that has become a sport, right? Whereas everything else goes to performance, and then they're just empty movements. No one knows the application. The forms has been modified to for the sake of performance, right?
Yeah, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't say all. I mean, it's just bad to generalize here, because I know how to use my stuff, and I've met a lot of people in China and in the West who do traditional Chinese martial arts, who know how to use their stuff. It's true that it's a relatively very small percentage of the population of said practitioners, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it's on the rise.
They're dwindling in number.
You think? Maybe I think that in the West there is a rise in practical approaches to traditional Chinese martial arts.
Right, in the West.
Sometimes.
Even though I'm going to make a controversial statement, you probably would agree there is that to applicable Chinese martial arts, has to be developed from abroad, not in China itself, because of the restrictions from the state. Would you agree with that?
I think that was correct in the 1950s, 60s, 80s, maybe 90s, but nowadays, not so sure, because I've been to China relatively recently, in the 2010s. And throughout the time I spent in China, which was 6 months in total, there was a lot of openness to martial practice of all kinds. There was no persecution of actual, combative practice out of a sports context. Even though we'll get to that incident with the MMA fighter and the Thai teacher.
We're all going to talk about that.
But that's rather that's unusual. I mean, it's because it was on TV. When you were in the park, I saw sparring in the park, and it wasn't sports sparring, and it's not frowned upon. The party members, the folks in the uniform around there, they see it happening. They don't mind. It's not frowned upon. It's not considered bad by the party as far as I could see. We will get to this in a moment. I just want to complete my answer, because there are two other very important reasons for what you mentioned, with the Chinese going more for the flowery and the performance side of things, and less for the sport. So one thing is related to what we just said. The Chinese government, it does not like a martial influence upon society, because historically speaking, whenever arose a group of martial artists and they became popular and they merged their schools, maybe, or one school became very, very big and influential, and then from a school they founded a society, and then it's like a members club, and then that members club gathered a few villages together, and wouldn't you know, in a short amount of time, months or a few years, they had a rebellion. And not once, not twice, but many dozens, maybe hundreds of times, even throughout Chinese history, that sort of thing happened, because they got martial arts, they know how to use empty hands and weapons to harm other people or to promote their agendas, and then they operate very far from the government, because there's not even mail, not to mention electricity or anything like that, and they can build up to a strength of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people opposing the government by the time the government finds out. and the Communist Party, they know this. They know that it's a problem, so they cut it at the onset. They don't let people build up these large societies of folks who are interested in actual martial application of what they do, because it's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you have 1,000 people who are really good at fighting, then they want to fight something. What would they fight? It's very easy to go against the government. So
maybe this is analogous to America with gun ownership.
Oh, that's very controversial right there, my friend. Yeah, some argue in the United. I won't convey an opinion, whether I'm pro or against Second Amendment, everything like that. I have an opinion about this, but it's not related to the podcast. Suffice to say that yes, in the United States, there are people who say that the government is interested in subduing gun ownership because they're afraid that people might rebel against them.
Right.
And ironically, the American Constitution, that's what it set up the Second Amendment for. So the people wouldn't be tyrannized by a dictatorial government. So in any case, that's not...
Right.
That's getting too controversial here.
Okay.
So one more thing, and that's maybe the most important reason for what we're talking about.
Right.
Is that we have a tension between China and the West, and West and East in general, between truth and social harmony. Now, I will relate this to our discussion. So, truth is science. Truth is we have a competition. One guy is third place, another guy is second place, one guy is first place. So we get like one guy who's just technically, empirically, statistically, whatever, better than the other folks, or one thing, or one principle. There is one truth. And in the West, truth is sacred. It's like a religious thing. If to get the truth out, you can destroy a life. So people, I mean, and you notice this, as a Chinese person, you get what I'm talking about, right? It's very different to traditionalist Chinese mindset. So Chinese, originally, the Confucian way, believes in social harmony. Right. Now, the social harmony clashes with truth because Confucius's teachings basically hint to you. I think he doesn't. He never says you should lie. He actually says you should be truthful, and Buddhism also says you should be truthful. But as a matter of fact, in China, if you can tell a white lie or even a big lie, and that lie saves face to somebody, that lie helps someone get a job, that lie helps a son or a daughter get into university and have a life, or that lie helps save a family, or even just, that lie helps save a friendship, then that lie is worthy because that lie induces social harmony. Now, if you want the truth only, then truth is controversial, and everybody's got their own one truth, and that goes against social harmony. Whenever you go for the truth, there is turmoil.
You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth.
You can't handle the truth. It's a very American thing to say.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, what I've learned on that topic is saying, usually when people say stuff to you, usually the most hurtful comments, right, are typically the most honest and truthful ones.
Indeed. Yeah. But once more, is this useful? Sometimes you can tell the truth to someone's face. The end result being you wouldn't be talking to each other anymore, and that person is not going to change either. So, did you achieve anything with that truth? That's what a Chinese person would say. I mean, truth, okay, it's good, it's important, but if it does not produce social harmony, then maybe we shouldn't be using truth. Rather, we should use other things. So, here's the thing: the Chinese traditionally they don't like competition. Why is you mentioned archery and Confucianism, and there's a good reason for that, because Confucian was talking all throughout the Analects and other texts about Junzi, and Junzi being it's translated as the gentleman, but actually the virtuous person, right? The benevolent person, who's just what they call them mensch in Yiddish, and mensch is like a decent human being. So What constitutes that gentleman, that virtuous person? Well, you read the Analects and you see, he says the junzi is this, the junzi is that. And one of the things that Confucius says in the Analects is the junzi does not compete apart from in archery. And why archery? It's interesting because in archery, you all strive for the same goal, you aim for the same place, and even if my arrow slit your arrow, or even if our arrows get stuck right next to each other, we don't hurt each other for that sort of competition. So that's a very gentlemanly form of competition, which is why he says, oh, that's a good thing, but other competition, not so much. But actually, it's funny because they made archery a big thing, but he wasn't necessarily talking just about archery. He was talking about a gentlemanly competition versus a non-gentlemanly one, right?
Right.
So here's the thing: China is based on Confucian values, and the Chinese people traditionally they don't like putting two people on a platform and having one come on top of the other because that's not socially harmonious, and that's not how the junzi behaves. And if we look at the various imperial dynasties of China, most of them had a very strong Confucian influence. So the people calling the shots, the people giving the money for or sanctioning or allowing for any competitions are these Confucians. The government officials were elected, or actually not elected, they were chosen by undergoing the tests, the national testing, and the national testing was primarily on the Confucian classics. So if you were a government official, most likely you were a very avid supporter of Confucianism in some way or form, and in that sense you weren't competitive, or so maybe you were competitive, but you were not keen on this kind of public competition when you got one clear winner and one clear loser, because that's not socially harmonious.
So judging from what you said, it kind of makes sense now to think of why is it that so many famous martial artists, especially in northern China, are Muslims, not from the Han ethnic group. Now that makes a lot more sense now, actually.
It does make sense. I never thought of it. So here's the thing. So China, since roughly 200 years ago, gradually began to adopt things from the West. Initially, most Chinese didn't want to. It was forced upon them by the Western nations. I think maybe a lot of our listeners who are less familiar with Chinese history don't know that China has been thoroughly abused financially, physically, criminally, whatever, by many Western nations for about 200 years period. I'm talking about the British, the Americans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Germans, the French, and who else? Who else was there?
Russians, even?
The Russians, yeah. All of these nations, they came to China and they just plundered the land. The Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty, gradually became weaker and weaker, and it just lost its control over the land, and the Western powers came and they took over and they stole the resources, and they co-conspired with the Chinese government eventually to basically make most of the Chinese population opium addicts, which is a huge crime that no one is being punished for. And I mean, it's too late. We're several generations after that, but it's a horrendous crime. And then the Chinese, having went through all of this, they were not so keen in the beginning to adopt Western culture and mindset and philosophy. But gradually they figured, and Chinese, they're said by many to be very practical people, they figured, well, if we want to deal with this, we have to learn the Western ways, and that gradually began to seep in. And then with this came competition and a competitive spirit, an imperial spirit, which was very prominent in France, in Germany, in Britain, especially the United States. And nowadays, we see the culmination of over 200 years of that influence, with China struggling with its national identity. On one hand, after having done with traditional communism, the government wants to have modernism, and it wants to have capitalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, the state is still, extremely tyrannical, and you can't do anything without the knowledge of the state. It's like saying, it's like that old saying, only badly behaved children don't want regulation from, supervising adults. I mean, that's kind of like the same mentality, right? Over there, it's like, if you don't want
course,
to,
it's still
only evil
still
people
very
don't
much
want the state. Only bad
Definitely,
people
definitely.
don't want the state. Don't want the knowledge of the
still-
state. Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't hear your last sentence.
Yeah, they're saying only criminals, don't want the knowledge of the state to know what you're doing. That's kind of like that kind of mentality there.
Yeah, of course. And of
Yeah.
course, it's still a very fierce dictatorship.
Right.
However, they do want to modernize, at least in the economic sense. And they're struggling with this because they also want to go back to their Confucian roots. And then they got this tension again between truth and social harmony. And this brings us to the discussion we were talking about earlier about the incident between the MMA fighter and the so-called Taiji teacher, yeah?
Yeah.
So this really brings forth this kind of tension. So these two individuals, a legit MMA fighter and teacher, and Taiji Chuan charlatan, someone with no legitimate traditional skill, who is essentially an internet troll. He went on some forum and began to troll this MMA fighter and other people, and they were fighting over the internet for months. And then, like two little children, they went to sort it out in the play yard. But rather than do it quietly, they brought the cameras along.
Right.
And the media, which is always very provocative and irresponsible, what they made of this in China and especially abroad is like a fight between East and West. It's the MMA versus Chinese traditional Taiji Chuan. Even though the MMA fighter was legit, and the Taiji Chuan teacher was not, and even though the MMA fighter was a much bigger person, much stronger, more skilled and experienced, and as far as we can tell, the Taiji guy had no experience whatsoever. He's just a megalomaniac.
Right.
So, of course, the Taiji guy gets beat up, and this goes all over the media in China and all across the world.
Yeah.
And the Chinese government panics because this is a huge disruption to social harmony. Now, instead of accepting that there's MMA, there's Chinese martial arts, everything is legit, we can live in harmony with each other, suddenly there's like this American thing just tramping, just being very rude toward Chinese traditions on camera. And it's just seen everywhere that something which is American just completely humiliated something which is considered very innately Chinese. And people listening to this who are not aware should be aware that for decades now, the Chinese government has been investing millions and millions and millions into promoting Taiji Chuan as a martial art, as like the root of Chinese culture, is an embodiment of everything which is Chinese and healthy.
I mean, like, there's a reason why they promote a style that really doesn't have any practical combat value, right? I mean, because they don't want the martial artists to fight, right? Because if they really want applicable Chinese martial arts, they should spend millions and millions and millions to promote, northern praying mantis instead. You know what I'm saying?
No, I think I would not agree with you here. I think that it's just first of all, I don't wish to generalize because I have personally met a number of Taiji teachers who are very capable. I just name a few. If we're talking about Shifu Bluestein from Canada, who's also teaching in Shandong, or my friend Shifu Bluestein, and quite a number of other Taiji Chuan practitioners who are very apt and skilled at what they do and can use it for fighting, most definitely. And I've seen and I've felt, and I've crossed hands with quite a few Taiji practitioners. While it is true that probably over 99% of practitioners could not help themselves with using Taiji to lift a book up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a small community of people in the various branches of Taiji Chuan who can definitely use it as a martial art. But I think, no, the reason is a bit different because maybe, yes, today they enjoy the fact that Taiji is really cannot be used combatively by most people, and it's very convenient to promote that sort of quote-unquote martial art.
Yeah, otherwise, promote praying mantis. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. But here is why they don't promote praying mantis. They don't because historically, it was Taiji teachers who hopped on the political bandwagon. And from the early 1920s, 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
there were already Taiji teachers in Beijing who were very politically influential, like Wu Tunan.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other teachers who just got very famous, like Chen Fake.
Mm-hmm.
And later in the 80s, the so-called four tigers from Chen Village,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, right next to Shaolin, it's like a 3-hour drive from Shaolin. These people, like Chen Qiaowang, Chen Qiaoxing, who are the other folks, Chen Jinglei, and Zhu Tianzai, right?
Mm-hmm.
Zhu Tianzai. So these four folks, they became highly connected with Chinese government, and they kind of worked together to create this Taiji Disneyland, which is Chen Village, which is very similar in like commercial concept to what they did with Shaolin, and that's why they're so invested in Taiji Chuan. So it's like Nike had, not Nike, let's say Coke. It's like Coke came out with a new drink, and they've been promoting that drink for 40 years, and then just comes a guy who's a superstar somehow, and he drinks that in front of a camera, and then he vomits, and then he drinks the competitor's drink. It's like, oh, this is so much better, and that drink sucks. And you just invested like 40 years in promoting that drink, and he ruined your public image in like 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he didn't even intend to do this, He just had a quest against all the phonies in Chinese martial arts.
That was his claim. I mean, he wants to beat up the fake frauds. He's not there to compete against, combat athletes. Even he said that himself.
Yeah, but unfortunately, so everyone overreacted. In the West, they overreacted. So everywhere this thing went, I mean, even in Israel, they introduced this as Taiji is ineffective, period, and look at this MMA, that's what's effective. And then in China, the government overreacted by persecuting the poor MMA fighter. They closed his gym for at least a while, and they arrested him.
And then they staged. It got so bad because it started a trend, and and all the traditionalists are getting beat up because now, they couldn't use it in a fight against the modern combat sport athletes, and it got so bad that the state are like rigging fights on TV to show.
But here we go, rigging fights. I mean, what's rigging fights? That's untruthful, right? That's lying.
Yeah.
But the lie is used to promote social harmony, and in traditional Chinese culture, sometimes this can be justifiable from their point of view, even though we might disagree. But it's a lie
from martial
to
arts.
promote social harmony.
From a martial artist point of view, that's actually unethical to do that. From a martial artist's point of view, right? You have to let skill itself, let your sport combat skill speaks for itself, right? Reality doesn't lie. If you got your ass beat, you got your ass beat. You know what I'm saying? And then they have to, yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like why earlier in the recording, why I asked, perhaps. Applicable Chinese martial arts can thrive, but only can thrive abroad, precisely because of the point you made, is that the Chinese government is so restrictive because of progress and social harmony stuff, it inhibits the development of martial arts.
So that brings about an interesting question. I mean, does Chinese martial art need like a lot of development? It's very controversial. A lot of people say.
I think it does. No question.
Well, in my point of view, it does and it doesn't. One thing is a lot of people believe that the meaning of tradition is we keep doing the same thing for 10 generations. This I disagree with. I think that when you have enough experience and skill, you ought to augment and change your martial art to what you see fit, and especially change it to suit your own values and philosophy and
evolution.
Yeah, and your body structure, it doesn't make sense. If you studied your martial art from someone who's 6'4", and you are 5'4", then maybe in the very beginning, maybe the first 3 or 4 years, you gotta do what he tells you to do. But eventually, you gotta start augmenting this to your physical reality, because you can't pretend that you're the same.
Yeah, I mean, you have to figure stuff out, and you have to think and understand the science and figure things out. I mean, it's what life is all about. It's life itself is like that.
Oh, my Shifu in Xinyichuan, he told me that if in 10 when I just start learning from him, he said, if in 10 years your Kung Fu looks exactly like my Kung Fu, then you failed as a student and I have failed as a teacher.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that I seldom see anyone tell their students. This is very important.
Right, good point on that.
But the other side to it is that traditional martial arts have a lot to give that people don't get to even learn, because the way you study originally traditional Chinese martial arts, it's a whole system of being and thinking and training, and people don't put in the time to really understand the art before they change it, and that's also a problem. I mean, for most Chinese martial arts, has to be anywhere between 4 to 7 years of daily practice with. And under a qualified teacher, you may not see the teacher every day, but you have to practice every day 4 to 7 years to really get it. Then you can change it to whatever you see fit, but you have to get it. And you have to get a complete transmission. Now, a complete transmission doesn't necessarily mean that you studied all the forms, all the drills, all the possible applications, which is sometimes impossible. Sometimes, like with Zhou Shifu, for instance, in China, the guy knew hundreds and hundreds of forms and several styles of martial art. You can never study everything from him. But with one style, with one tradition, with one thing, you can get the essence of it. 4 to 7 years, or maybe 5.5 years on average, you ought to be able to get it. I mean, I think it was Wang who said in one article, when he was asked how long does it take to study fully and seriously the Chen-style Taiji curriculum, I think he said 5.5 years. And it makes sense. And a lot of people tell you, oh, you get a martial art, you never stop learning. Oh, well, of course you never stop learning. But how much time ought it take to really learn the curriculum well? If you train every day, if you see your teacher at least twice or thrice a week, shouldn't take you over 7 years. No way. It doesn't make any sense. And if it takes more than that, then usually that means you weren't practicing hard enough, you weren't looking into it hard enough, maybe your teacher doesn't know how to teach that well. And again, this is extremely controversial to say, but really think about it. If you're listening at home, if you were training over 2 hours a day, I'm saying over 2 hours a day every single day, unless you're ill or something, and then you see your teacher at least twice or thrice a week, and they want to teach you, and they give you new material every now and then. Then why should it take more than 7 years to learn a martial art? It doesn't make any sense. Even, there's some Bagwajang systems that have an enormous, huge curriculum, and still people get it in about 7 years.
Well, I mean, that is, fighting with Bagwajang is a different story.
Well, it's very... Look, the higher you aim with the concepts, the more difficult it is to put it to practice. But just to go back to what
Good point on that. That was a nice quote.
Just want to complete my point here. You need to get that transmission. If you don't have that transmission, you don't get the art in your body, then you'd never be able to use it. Doesn't matter if you train it for 30 or 40 or 700 years. Doesn't matter. You have to get a certain, what they call in Xingyi, they would call it structure. Okay, the structure of the art. But every martial art has a structure. You have to walk in the footsteps of your martial ancestors for long enough. You have to actually walk the walk they did, literally speaking, and then you get the type of mindset and the type of body structure that they had, and then you can really understand the art. Then you can judge its worth.
Right. Absolutely.
And you know, most people who say that there's something wrong with Chinese martial arts, most of them have not gotten the full transmission. Maybe they're correct. They might be correct, but it doesn't mean that they say this from a knowledgeable perspective. It doesn't mean that they have actually gotten to the point where they were actually able to try and use the art as it is.
You know who said that? Who said a similar thing? Like criticism on the Chinese martial arts was a Chinese martial arts master, Grandmaster Wang. He was extremely critical about the traditionalist mindset and systems, and he literally, I mean, he sounded like that MMA guy, right? You know who I'm talking about?
Yes, and but that person is often taken out of his historical context because he, like Bruce Lee, I think he was very similar to Bruce Lee of all people.
Right.
Just Bruce Lee was more polite, and Wang Qianjia just went out in articles saying this teacher is bullshit and that style is bullshit, and you all are doing bullshit, and all of this traditional stuff that's not scientific. I have the scientific stuff. I'm teaching the real stuff. So it's in part that was.
But he can back up. He can back up his claims because he went there. He threw down with people, right?
Yeah,
he didn't win all of them, but you know
that's according to his testimony in his articles, mind you, right?
Well, I mean, he did claim that he lost to a guy in Fujian, to a White Crane guy.
Yeah, but so he also says
he didn't win all of them.
He also says that he went all throughout China and he could beat up everybody. So, you know, imagine if there was an MMA fighter nowadays who says, I went all across America and I beat up everybody. And it was just, there was this one guy and we had 5 matches and I won 3 and he won 2. And you'd say, yeah, maybe that happened, but it's very unlikely that you went all across America and you could just beat up everybody.
With the White Crane guy was like that, right? He was, you know, we went through. He said we went each other a couple of times. You know, I won 3, he won 4, and you know, and he learned White Crane technique from the guy because, you know, hey, you can beat me. Let me learn from you. So he was, you know, very practical and very realistic about himself, right?
Yeah, in that sense, applause to him. I mean, the guy did something that maybe more people ought to do. But let me ask you this: that's if this story is true, and he really learned from this person. Where's the Baihe trend? Where's the White Crane in modern Dacheng training,
there is actually some White Crane stuff. It was shown to me a little bit, but you know, let's not go into the details.
Well, as far as I've seen, I mean, maybe 2 or 3 movements, but it's not really what. Maybe he borrowed, like, if that guy was so good, apparently he didn't take a lot from him.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, but you have to understand, Wang Qianjia, he was living in Tianjin at the time with many famous teachers of many different styles who are legit, and you know they are legit partly because they all have lineages coming down to our day with legit fighters. If you go to Tianjin and you talk or you train with the Bajichuan folks there are a lot of Baji-trained people in Tianjin and in Beijing who came from Tianjin, who are fighters. And they don't do sports fighting, they do a lot of sparring, and they do real fighting. There are even videos of some of these Chinese folks on YouTube from Beijing, I think, doing serious fighting. And they were at the time in Tianjin, and he was criticizing them as well. He was criticizing everybody, but he wouldn't go fight any of these folks.
Mm-hmm.
And he was because of the way he went about this. He was not a popular figure with some of these people.
Right.
It's true that he is respected nowadays for his achievements, for the lineage he has created, and he taught very good things.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many, many good, very good even, Yichuan practitioners nowadays.
Right.
Many of them, and they have good kung fu. But I mean, he was not a popular figure because he was doing something which was very un-Chinese, and trying to supposedly expose the truth, which was his truth, at the expense of social harmony.
Well, I mean, certain things just need to be said, right? You can't, live a life forever.
Well, it brings on the question, like, why did Wang Qianjia have to go on newspapers and carry on this fight against the so-called charlatans? If he really went all across China to fight folks prior, he could have gone and settled this, and in a more gentlemanly way. Why did it have to? Because, okay, look, reality is not black and white. Sometimes you got a teacher who's not the best fighter in the world. Maybe he can't carry himself well in sports fighting arena or even in sparring.
Mm-hmm.
But that person is a very good person, maybe. And that person, he can't fight himself, but he can teach others to fight. For instance, most boxing coaches, they can't fight anymore.
Right.
But they can teach fighters. So imagine if someone went on newspaper and picked out this boxing coach who was a very mediocre boxer when he was younger, and now he's fat and he can't fight at all. And he's saying, oh, this guy is a phony, this guy is teaching fighting, but he cannot fight. But maybe that guy could have trained some world champions. Or maybe he doesn't train world champions, but maybe this guy is helping 30 kids from rough neighborhoods to become better individuals and transcend very difficult circumstances in life. But when you go about on newspaper to expose the truth, the kind of social harmony that you go against, sometimes it can destroy people's lives in more than one way. So truth is important, but it has consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's left up to. It's more. Reality is a lot more complex.
Definitely.
Yeah. So okay, so let's. So we're well past an hour. Let's. One thing that I actually just have to ask you about, considering this is called the Real Fake Swords and Fake Real Swords podcast. What do you think the whole thing about? Have you gotten into any sword debates with traditional martial arts people?
Pardon? What did you ask?
Have you gotten into sword debates with traditional martial artists, especially traditional Chinese martial artists people? Just like I troll on social media, I keep on telling everybody that real Chinese swords are made out of tinfoil.
What do you mean? If I get into some internet fight with people over weaponry related topics?
Well, yeah, especially with swordsmanship, which is one thing.
I try to get away from this because partly, I have some criticism towards some of the people who teach Miao Dao these days. I don't want to name names, but they do things differently to how I do things. We don't see eye to eye, even though I've never spoken with them, but a lot of people are putting out videos and articles. I may disagree, but it does not mean that I don't respect their efforts. And if I were to go and say, oh, this is crap, first of all, sometimes these people might have 20 years more experience than I in the martial arts. And that alone should give them credit. Even if I disagree, maybe in a few years have more experience than their livelihood. And I have to consider that when I, as a teacher, I have martial virtue, and these people, they're not directly related to me, but when I criticize them, then someone might online, that someone may have considered, maybe going to their workshop, buying their DVD, purchasing a sword from them, etc., etc. And And now they might not do that because they saw my criticism and they respect what I have to say. And maybe I'm wrong, you know, and by being wrong, I could have hurt that person's livelihood. So I have to consider that.
If you listen to the episode 4 of this podcast, the one I did with Lancelot Chan, because the guy, you know, he did study the antiques and such. If the Chinese swords behave like the antiques do, and if he's right about, you know, how the antiques supposed to behave, then the weaponry aspects of the modern Chinese martial arts, okay, especially the swordsmanship part, I think every style is absolutely wrong.
Is it wrong, or is it wrong? It may be wrong historically, but it might not be wrong in terms of how you could use what they have in hand right now. So that's
you got to listen to that podcast, especially in the last question I asked them. But the whole idea of using the whippy stuff that you cannot gain anything from.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm in complete agreement with this. I think the tinfoil type of swords, they are good for a complete beginner, just for maybe a month or two at most. And some people shouldn't even start with that because it gives you a very full sense of how to use a weapon in general, not just bad habits. Sometimes you have to take into consideration there are women, there are younger folks. They might not be as strong, so you give them this tinfoil sword for just a month or two, just to learn the motions, just to get the basic coordination. But yeah, as soon as possible, you should get a real sword in your hands. And yes, they have a different point of balance, and they feel different, and they have a different thickness, and they don't shake, you know. But I'll give you another example from the perspective of spear. So nowadays in Chinese martial arts, most people use the baila spear. The baila is white waxwood, and it's a type of ash, and it's very, very common in China and relatively easy to get there. And this wood is exceptional. It's unique in that it's very soft, but it's very strong because the fibers are very long. And when the wood has very long fibers, then it absorbs the shockwave much better. The shockwave travels throughout the length of the fiber, and it dissipates. Rather than you take a wood that's maybe 5 times as strong or more, like ebony, or like some of the rosewoods, who might be very strong and dense, but then their fibers might not dissipate the shockwave as well, so they break. While the baila, which is a very soft wood, you could literally get shavings off it with a razor, you know, with a simple razor. Yet it's very sturdy for combative practice. So we use that baila a lot in Chinese martial arts, but that's not so historically accurate because, historically speaking, the woods used for spears and staffs were always stiff, and sometimes they did use baila, but they used the baila that's older and very dense, and it didn't shake much at all. Just, you know, a tiniest vibration. So why do we use the flexible baila? Because it has the benefit of helping you train your structure and helping you learn how to issue power, especially for empty-handed combat. Because when it shakes, the vibrations go back into your body, and there is an internal balancing thing going on there. Your structure has to balance the returning vibration and then put it back into the staff or the spear, and it gives you something. But historically speaking, that's like a form of incorrect practice. So maybe for some forms of strength training and structure training, you can use a more flexible spear. But then if you want realistic, historically accurate training and fighting, then you have to get a stiff spear. And that's the same thing with the flimsy tinfoil swords. They're not really, they're bad instruments for training, but sometimes for some purposes, that's what you gotta have. Take, for instance, a 65-year-old or a 70-year-old who just want to do a martial arts form. Doesn't have to be Tai Chi Chuan. Could be even like Northern Mantis. And you just can't put a real sword in their hand sometimes. They're not as strong.
At least use something heavier or something that have similar balance to, an antique sword. Here's a heavier wooden sword made of hickory, but you can still move it. But you need to apply some strength to it, right? But except compared to something that weighs nothing.
Yeah, but I don't know. Have you taught elderly populations?
Yeah, I'm actually right now because that's why we're gonna end this recording soon because I gotta go and to the senior center to teach this old lady.
That's wonderful. Yeah, so sometimes people come at you who are older, and what's for you like free warm-up exercises takes an hour of their time, and by the end, and the simplest warm-up exercises one can imagine, and they can't even do that without gasping for air or asking to rest every 5 minutes.
Right.
And so maybe these folks, they need the flimsy tinfoil swords for maybe a year until they get strong enough. So it has its use, but yeah, it's a very, very bad trend overall in the traditional Chinese martial arts. And you know what else? If you give someone a real sword, and they can actually move it around, they have enough strength, then a real metal sword, especially a Dao, because of its shape and just the way it looks and the cultural context, if you have someone who's lacking in self-confidence and self-esteem, and you teach them a Dao form, or even just a few exercises, this can help a person tremendously. Someone who's just very, very insecure overall, has zero charisma, is just they're afraid of their own shadow. You put the Dao in their hands, suddenly they feel just so brave. It's funny, but it's similar to the pirate. You're now a pirate. You have a cutlass. Yeah, and you know what? Sometimes it's funny, but that can do a whole more than in 5 minutes of teaching them something with a Dao than you might have been able to get out of them in 2 years of empty-handed practice.
Yeah, I'll try that today with Norma, with that old lady that I'm about to train.
Well, let's see. Hopefully that helps her.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, this is the longest recording. We're about 125. Well, no, 1 hour and 25 minutes. So this is the longest recording. So we'll have to end it now. And thank you very much for coming on. Thank you so much for providing me with this opportunity. I've had a great time, and hopefully get to discuss some more in the future. Yeah, definitely. So if anyone's interested, I have my academy here in Israel, and I also teach seminars abroad, and I've got my books. You can go on Amazon, write either Research of Martial Arts or The Martial Arts Teacher, and check the reviews, see what they're about. Yep. Jonathan Bluestein, everybody.